All right, Joshua, if you'll take your Bible and open to Joshua. I'm going to tell you something very important about the book of Joshua. Now get ready for it. It's not the first book of the Bible. Shocking, I know. But it's significant. It means as we read the book of Joshua, we are continuing on with this story that God has been telling about how he is going to rescue his people. And so we need to take a moment and think about that story. The Bible begins with God creating us, making this perfect world and this perfect place for us to enjoy his perfect presence. But what does man do? Of course, we know what man does. He rebels against God. And then God responds by judging but making a promise that he's going to send a seed of the woman to crush the head of the serpent. And yet man responds to that promise basically by rebelling against God over and over and over and over again. God judges man again, sends a flood, but once again he shows mercy. He chooses Noah and he saves Noah. He starts the world over again, and yet it's not very much longer until man has joined together with every other man on the planet, basically, to shake their fist at God. And so, again, God judges, but after that judgment, he shows mercy, and he makes a promise to a man named Abraham. And what is the promise he makes to that man, Abraham? He tells us that it's through Abraham he's going to send the seed who is going to be his means of blessing the entire world. And so in the first few books of the Bible, we're reading about how God is going to keep that promise he made in the beginning of the Bible, Genesis 3, and then more specifically to Abraham. But as the book of Deuteronomy ends, what parts of the promise that God made to Abraham are not fulfilled? He promised Abraham a descendant. He promised Abraham that he would be with him. He promised Abraham land, and he promised Abraham that he would, through Abraham, bring blessing to the entire world. And of course, the land promise is unfulfilled, and we still don't know exactly how God is going to bring blessing to the entire world through this nation, Israel, as sinful as they are. So you might say the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible, end on an unfinished note. While God has brought the people to the brink of the land, they're still on the brink. And though so much of the first 5 books of the Bible are about this promise of the land, as the book of Joshua begins, the people are still not in the land. And so as we begin reading this book, we have to begin reading it with an attitude of anticipation. Will God be able to do what he said he would? And that's an important question, because to be honest, the beginning of Joshua doesn't look good for the nation of Israel. After all, what does the first verse of Joshua say happened? Joshua 1:1, after the death of Moses, the servant of the Lord. And you can just stop and think about all that Moses has meant to the nation of Israel up to this point. He's the one God used to rescue them from Egypt. He's been leading them for 40 years through the wilderness. He's been the one who stood between God and them. He's the one who mediated the covenant for them. Moses is the one who rescued them from so many terrible situations. And so you can imagine Israel being tempted to believe that God's favor and their success was dependent on the ministry of Moses. And yet now, just as they're on the verge of having to go into Canaan and do battle against these fierce enemies in order to dispossess them from their land, Moses dies. And it's not like they've had a lot of time to prepare for his death either, because Deuteronomy 34:7 tells us that when he died, his eye was undimmed and his vigor was unabated. And so as a result, we can imagine and understand why the nation responded to his death the way they did. Deuteronomy 34:8 says, after Moses died, the people of Israel wept for Moses in the plains of Moab for 30 days. Then the days of weeping and mourning for Moses were ended. That's an entire month of crying. And while they may have been crying for Moses, I think they also were crying for themselves. Knowing the difficult time that Israel had trusting God's promises, it wouldn't be surprising if they were wondering, what chance do we have now to enter the promised land? And in the middle of this comes Joshua. Now, Joshua is not completely an unfamiliar figure, of course. We know a little bit about Joshua. For example, we know his name wasn't originally Joshua. Numbers 13:6 tells us that his name was actually not Joshua, it was Hosea. And Joshua gave him that name, Joshua. Moses renames him. Joshua means it's Yahweh who saves. Hosea means it's God who saves. So Moses gets more specific with Joshua's name. But there's more than just the name that we know about Joshua. There's also quite a few other things we know as well. Exodus chapter 17, verses 8 through 13 tells us that he was the one who went out and fought against Amalek as Moses' arms were being held up. Exodus chapter 33, verse 11 tells us that Joshua was Moses' assistant. Exodus chapter 24, verse 13 tells us that Moses and Joshua actually went up to the mountain of God. Joshua partially, but it was Joshua who went with him. And so we know a lot about Joshua, and yet even with all the information we know about Joshua, it doesn't make things much easier for Moses, for Israel. Moses has died, and now this man Joshua becomes their leader. But why? Why would God allow this to happen at this moment? You have to wonder. Perhaps God allows Israel's history to play out this way in order to make it very clear to them and to everyone else that he is the one who enabled them to defeat the Canaanites and conquer the land. Because clearly one of the themes of the book of Joshua is that it is God who will go before his people and win their battles for them. This theme is so important, in fact, that Joshua is sometimes called the book of the land. Some would see Joshua 18:1 as the key verse. What does Joshua 18:1 say happened? It says, the land laid subdued before them. One scholar writes, the major theme in the book of Joshua is the possession of the promised land. And we even see this in the structure of the book. The structure of Joshua is largely about Israel taking over the land. Chapters 1 through 5, Israel enters the land. Chapters 6 through 11, Israel takes the land. Chapters 12 through 22, Israel divides the land. Chapters 23 and 24, Israel is called to serve God in the land. With all this talk about the land, however, we might think that Joshua doesn't have much to do with us, but it does. Only you have to think a little. Why is the giving of the land so significant? It's so significant because of the connection with the Abrahamic covenant and the Mosaic covenant. What did God say he was going to do through Israel? He was going to bring blessing to the entire world. How does it seem like he's going to do that through Israel? By placing them in the promised land, almost like a Garden of Eden again, you remember? As they obey God, he's just going to pour out blessings on them and show people what it's like to live with God as king, so that the whole world would be drawn to God. So as we read Joshua, we're reading about how God is going to rescue the world. That's what we're interested in. And the first part of Joshua focuses on Israel's conquering the land. And how they conquered the land says a lot. When we think of Joshua, we often think of the battles that we read about in this book. But really, as Dwight Howard explains, its battles were not battles at all in the typical sense of the word. They were not massive military-style confrontations between well-trained forces with the Israelites prevailing via a combination of superior forces and tactics. Rather, the Israelites won with the Lord's help, often through direct divine intervention. Most dramatically, you think of Jericho. And always with his help and guidance. It was God who gave the victories and the Israelites who reaped the benefits. Also, the Israelites were not like most conquering armies in that for the most part they left intact the cities they conquered. They killed the inhabitants and then they were able to settle in the cities and houses they had not built as a gift from God. And what a gift. The land is pictured, as we said, in almost Garden of Eden type language. In a sense, the story of the Bible so far is Eden lost, Canaan found. And looking forward, we know Israel is going to continue to enjoy the land if they are faithful to the covenant they made with God. And knowing how important the land is helps us understand the second half of Joshua, because a major portion of the second half of Joshua is focused on the specific inheritance that is given to the different individuals and tribes. And the truth is, this part of the book is usually more difficult reading for us, but it was an important part in God's great plan because it shows the land promises were fulfilled in very real and specific ways. As one author explains, it's as if the writer of the book is saying, if you don't believe that God keeps his promises, here's the map. And here are the details. You can check them out for yourself. And while some of those details may seem a bit obscure as we read them, knowing God is able to keep his promises is essential. That's part of why we're reading all of this about the land. It's to teach us something about God. In fact, let's take a moment and try to identify the main thing the author's trying to teach us about God by reading and comparing a few passages in Joshua. Note what God says and what happens, and what that tells us about the character of God. Joshua 1, 2 through 4. Moses, my servant, is dead. Now therefore arise, go over this Jordan, you and all this people, into the land that I'm giving them to the people of Israel. Every place that the sole of your feet will tread upon, I have given to you, just as I promised Moses, from the wilderness and this Lebanon, as far as the great river, the river Euphrates, all the land of the Hittites to the great sea, toward the going down of the sun, shall be your territory. Joshua 11, 23. So Joshua took the whole land according to all that the Lord had spoken to Moses. Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 11. God says, I will give you houses full of good things that you did not fill, and cisterns that you did not dig, and vineyards and olive trees that you did not plant. Joshua 24, verse 13. Joshua says, God says, I gave you a land on which you had not labored, and cities that you had not built, and you dwell in them. You eat the fruit of vineyards and olive orchards that you did not plant. Joshua chapter 3, verse 7. The Lord said to Joshua, today I will begin to exalt you in the sight of all Israel, that they may know that as I was with Moses, so I will be with you. Joshua 4, verse 14. On that day the Lord exalted Joshua in the sight of all Israel, and they stood in awe of him, just as they had stood in awe of Moses all the days of his life. And actually on and on. As we look at Israel entering the land and we read this story, it's obvious Joshua is trying to make a number of things about God very clear to us. And the first and foremost is that God keeps his promises. Specifically, God promised the land, and God gave Israel the land, just like he promised and told their fathers. How does Joshua summarize what happens in his book in Joshua chapter 21, verses 43 through 45? He says, "Thus the Lord gave to Israel all the land that he swore to give to their fathers, and they took possession of it, and they settled there. And the Lord gave them rest on every side, just as he had sworn to their fathers. Not one of all their enemies had withstood them, for the Lord had given all their enemies into their hands. Not one word of all the good promises that the Lord had made to the house of Israel had failed. All came to pass." There's no question that God is the hero of this book. He is the faithful God who fulfills his promises. And it's really important as we read the book of Joshua to keep God at the center, because what happens in Joshua only makes sense if God is absolutely holy and supreme, because there is really a great deal of killing in this book. And sometimes people wonder, how is that acceptable? And ultimately, to come to grips with what Israel does in this book, we have to come to grips with the greatness of God. James Hamilton puts it like this: "The total destruction of the inhabitants of the land is just only if the deity who calls for such a measure is worthy of all honor. If Yahweh's worth is not so great that those who reject him have committed a crime that cries out for infinite justice, then the zero tolerance policy against the people of the land is a brutal atrocity. But Yahweh's policies are not like those of mere men, whose importance does not warrant the slaughter of their opponents. Nor is this kind of a immature, self-centered phase that Yahweh eventually grows out of when he decides to be nice and send his son Jesus. Rather, the ban on the Canaanites heralds the infinite majesty of the justice of Yahweh, whose holiness demands perfect loyalty, whose worth is such that anything less than absolute allegiance defiles unto death. The conquest of Canaan enacts the glory of God's justice against those who look to worthless things to be for them what only God can be for them." Joshua wants you to know that God is God, and that he is glorious, and that he is faithful to his promises to save and to judge. And we're going to continue to look at the book of Joshua in the following videos more specifically to learn more about this God and to learn more about how he keeps his promises. But before we do that, I want you to take a moment and watch the video that I've attached to this one from the Bible Project. And then as you watch, just take some notes about what it teaches you about the flow of this book.